The space race took place in the heart of the Cold War. This was a time of hostility between the U.S. and the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union. Although no shots were fired, the war was more of a technological advancement race, for example, nuclear weapons and the space race. The space race was symbolic of which country was more powerful. In 1957, when the Soviets launched their satellite, known as Sputnik 1, the space race was on between the USSR and the United States of America. Sputnik 1 was the first spacecraft to ever reach Earth's orbit. The Soviets seemed to have the edge as they followed up a few weeks with Sputnik 2, which put a dog named Lako into orbit. The rate of the Soviet advancement was pressuring a key response to the United States. By the end of 1957, the Soviets successfully put a spacecraft in Earth's orbit, and the U.S. was far behind.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster, in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite. One of the great scientific feats of the age.
The United States wanted to show technological advancement and dominance over the Soviet Union, so they responded by launching Explorer 1 just a few months later and launching NASA later that same year. A few years later, a new space program, Project Mercury, was initiated, as the goal of the program was to have a manned spacecraft. However, the United States suffered shock as shortly after Project Mercury, the Soviets were the first to have astronauts orbit Earth in 1961, named Yuri Gagarin.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Let it be clear, and this is a judgment which the members of the Congress must.
The United States was now obligated to make significant progress. President Kennedy had stood before Congress in 1961 asking for $7 to $9 billion for the space program, stating this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. So, therefore, the U.S. started multiple programs, each advancing the last, to achieve the goal of landing a human on the moon. This led up to the Apollo program, which was famous for NASA's success story. On July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins lived Kennedy's dream by landing on the moon. 6 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong became the first human to step foot on the moon.
The surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, triumph leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
The United States restored faith in its population by landing the first people on the moon. Even though the United States virtually defeated the Soviets in the space race, the arms race was ongoing. Each country kept progressing their nuclear weapons. The basis of this competition was from the United States' attempt in containing communism. They felt at the time that the supreme world power would have the most influence on developing countries. So the goal from the Cold War was to minimize communism and spread democracy. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and the planets beyond, and we have vowed we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. Quote, former President John F. Kennedy. The duel with the Soviets was very influential on history, as it allows the global economy to be competitive instead of equally distributing the wealth. At the time, many countries were in developing stages, influenced by whomever the supreme authority was. The United States brought feelings of fear to the idea of communism to its people. For example, McCarthyism, which was the paranoia of communism in the United States. Considering the situation, national pride was essential, and the victory in the space race spiked patriotism in the United States. Neil Armstrong landing on the moon won the U.S. the space race. With the media emphasizing the space race, he became a national hero. Though the Cold War didn't end for a couple of decades, America had shown its resilience and superiority without using force. The 1960s were crazy with good and bad. The Cold War started. Martin Luther King was assassinated. John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and the United States won the space race. Through the rough times, the United States survived and rose to be a supreme world power. The following sources were used in the production of this project.